For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu.
So much of education is really about what we know and that we're valued for what we know. And I think being in the prison, when I think about agency and about hope, it's really about being valued for who we become. I think the clearest insight for me in the prison was when people described hope. So much of their identity was stuck. They were trapped in their mistakes or trapped in their behaviors that got them incarcerated. And so when they talked about hope, hope was always about being able to be who they are, but also become who they're supposed to be. The possibility of becoming more. How do our classroom become spaces where they can be and become? A space where there's collaboration and communal encounter and connection, where people can really encounter each other as human beings. When you're teaching in the prison classroom, the student's life become text.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. How do you find hope when you can only see yourself and your future in light of your past mistakes? When you're certain that everyone on the outside looking in is doing the same, punishing you, immobilizing you, invisibilizing you? It seems that maybe the only way out of that spiral is the God who sees, El Roi. That's the name that the Egyptian slave Hagar gave to God when he spared her life and assured her of her son's life in Genesis 16. This way of seeing oneself, being surveilled, and yet somehow also being invisibilized, it takes on a new meaning when we consider that right now, the Vatican is sponsoring an art exhibit in an active women's prison. An exhibit called With My Eyes. Pope Francis, even in his poor health, just visited the exhibit/prison in April 2024. As part of the Venice Biennale, an international art festival, the Vatican transformed the Giudecca Women's Detention Home into the Holy See Pavilion, an art exhibit that redefines the prison with a new way of seeing. And if you want to see it with your eyes, you have to make a reservation, you have to get a background check, travel to the island prison off the southern coast of Venice, and then be led through it by a female prisoner herself. You wouldn't just be an art connoisseur, you'd be a guest of these incarcerated women. Now, this is a beautifully fitting example for our episode today. With me on the show is Sarah Farmer, a former research fellow of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and a practical theologian, and she agreed to talk with me about her recent book, Restorative Hope, Creating Pathways of Connection in Women's Prisons. Sarah describes the experience of prison, the ways it constrains movement, how it abridges and threatens agency, and how the constant surveillance leaves a person both constantly seen and yet somehow invisible. She illuminates the approach to theological education that she and her colleagues put on offer for these women, these incarcerated theologians whose very lives are the texts to learn from. Sarah offers a contribution from Womanist Theology, Dolores Williams' re-narration of Hagar, from the book of Genesis that I mentioned earlier, the seemingly forgotten, invisibilized Egyptian slave of Abram and Sarai. Hagar is the mother of Ishmael, and she's the woman who named God El Roi, the God who sees. In total, Sarah, through her book and in this conversation, imagines a restorative hope built around self-respect and identity, connection, and resilience. A hope that shines even into the darkness of a woman's prison cell. All with the hope of seeing and being seen with new eyes. Thanks for listening today. Sarah, it's such a delight to have you on For the Life of the World. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Sarah, it sounds like your early development, whether it's your childhood or early experience, has really led you to this point of caring about practical theology, caring about the kinds of community development issues that you do. I wonder if you share a little bit about your personal background.
Absolutely.
About what led you to this particular project, looking at women's imprisonment and incarceration.
I often tell people that I grew up in a community where young people going to prison was more of a rites of passage than going to college. I didn't know how much it shaped me, but it was definitely shaping me. And I think when I probably got into my PhD program is finally when I had language to understand what was happening. And this came about, I was taking a course with Maisha Wynn, and she was teaching literacy as a civil rights, and the topic around the school to prison pipeline came up. And it became really clear to me that what I had witnessed growing up with seeing so many young people incarcerated, I saw that enfleshed growing up. And so this gave me a language for it. And as I was taking that course as a PhD student, I was also serving as a teacher's assistant in a course where everyone in that class was chaplains in the prison. So having this experience where I was shaping really an interest for me to say, oh, I want to get into the prison and I want to teach in that setting. And so another student who was taking the educational studies course with me, Keisha Green, we decided to co-teach a course in the prison. And the reason why I taught with her was because she had the Inside Out training. Inside Out is the program where you're trained to take students who are outside the prison. So they're outside students inside the prison to have one class with both outside students, which would be university students, and inside students, which would be those persons who are incarcerated. And that was actually my first time in the prison. And I think going in, I had a lot of assumptions about how I would be able to relate as a Black woman, as a woman who has experienced marginalization because of race and class, as one who so many of my network growing up had been incarcerated. I thought I would be able to relate really easily. And I wasn't. I was confronted in some ways with my own privilege. And so that really gave me a deeper interest into this topic around incarceration and confinement.
Going to prison to be this rite of passage, more than going to college. I wonder if you could speak to the expectation there. And I'm really thinking about stuckness. You talk about a community that's stuck in that way of thinking. And for me, this relates to your book's topic of agency and the feeling that, to become mature, to become an adult, to become experienced is to go to prison. It's not to become educated. It's not to become free in the sense of the kind of freedom that education offers. I wonder if you can comment on that.
So I think two things happen in this context. The first way of thinking about this idea around stuckness is just this idea that your imagination is automatically foreclosed. And I will never forget this story about a substitute teacher who substituted at a school in Philly. Philly is less than 30 minutes from Chester. And she had went to pick up the ball of a young boy in elementary school. And she's making easy talk like, how are you doing? What do you want to be when you grow up? And he says, I want to be a basketball player. And so she's like, great. And he's still standing there with this kind of look on his face. And she's like, what is it? Why are you still looking like that? And he says, because I'm trying to figure out if I should go to prison first, before or after basketball. And so just this idea that prison is a fixed reality in so many children's minds is part of the kind of stuckness around imagining other possible futures. The other one, or the other way in which I've thought about this in the book, is just this idea around mobility. And this part of the drive is to move away from this kind of carcerality that is a fixed notion in the back of people's reality. And I'm saying it in very real ways. Like, there are some schools that have guards in them. There are some schools that literally sit across the street from prisons. And so just this real kind of spatio-temporal reality that is also at play when I'm thinking about just hope and incarceration and ideals around stuckness.
Yeah. You talk about the first time I think you were ever in a prison right away at the beginning of the book as well. And I'm wondering if you would describe a little bit about that.
This kind of stiffness almost comes over you as you go through the metal detector, as you sit in everything is surveilled. It's so disorienting to have to be checked at every entryway. Do you belong here? People are patting you down and have a suspicion about whether or not you can be in that space. We could sit at a table, but you have guards walking around you the whole time. I don't know, just feeling like I was holding my breath the whole time because even though I wasn't thinking of doing anything wrong, there are so many rules that you feel like you're just on high alert, you're hyper vigilant. I think you feel when you're no longer surveilled, like because of the hyper vigilance and the hyper awareness, when you leave the space, you feel the difference.
And you talk about mobility too, like the fact that you're able to move. And I want to connect this now to the title of your book, Restorative Hope. You talk about movement and mobility as this very important aspect of hope. And I think this is a really evocative way to think about hope. What's working there for you about mobility and how central the concept of movement is to hope?
This idea around hope comes from the women's stories. I wasn't just interested in what hope means for them, but I was interested in what hope does for them. And so much about hope is about movement, moving against, moving through, moving among, moving within, moving beyond. And so when I thought about hope, it wasn't a static thing. It wasn't abstract, ephemeral thing. It was forward moving, away from carcerality, but towards possibility and life-giving possibility. And so how I talk about hope as a form of mobility is hope as that movement, that driving force that enables people to move toward. It could be as simple as breath. When I talk about resilience and embodied resilience, I'm simply talking about breath. The fact that our very being is alive points to a possibility, even when everything else speaks against.
Yeah. And I think that this is speaking to the very mission, or like you described the goal of your book being helping expand the definition of hope into these dehumanizing contexts. Because I think it's easy to use words like hope and think from the outside and looking in on a dehumanizing context like the carceral system. Hope's almost too easy at times, but we need to expand it to really unearth how it's operating even in these very dehumanizing and demeaning contexts.
Absolutely. I hope people leave the book knowing that hope is not sanitized, that it's a navigational tool to get through life, but it doesn't mean that challenges and difficulty won't come. And people who are in dehumanizing contexts, I think, have something to teach us about what it means to hope.
So I think this is like that point where we need to frame it in the context of incarcerated women. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hoping to get a clearer picture for myself and for the listener about the experience of women in prison and what that carceral experience is like and the kind of issues they face. How would you orient and introduce women's prison to someone who is just unfamiliar?
Absolutely. First I would say that there's not enough research on women's prisons. Maybe just in the last couple of years, you see more research on women's prisons. But I think it's important to know that prison really wasn't designed for women. And so even when I think about like women's carcerality, I think about the first question is around how women enter the prison system, which is very different from men. And Marian Wright Edelman uses the term cradle to prison pipeline, where she's really trying to identify poverty as one of the gateways into prison, partly because poverty plays a role in the unmet needs, physical, emotional, mental needs of women, which then go unmet, which then results in women's counterproductive ways of coping. And that could be substance use disorder, which then leads to property offenses, or for girls in particular, becoming runaways, so truancy. And this is important because unlike men who oftentimes might be in prison for more violent offenses, women are often incarcerated for property offenses, drug offenses, offenses that relate to relational. They did something for their partner and it got them incarcerated. Is one scholar talks about us kind of punishing or criminalizing the survival strategies of women. Also just the over-policing of women, the criminalization of women as they enter the system. So I think entering the system is a big thing. And then once they get into the system, because the prison wasn't designed for them, a lot of the things they come in there with, such as they have issues around mental health, it's exasperated. And you can think about just isolation, for instance, when people go into lockdown and they're locked up for 23 hours straight, the ways in which that alone kind of can exasperate. It's the same thing for healthcare is not up to par. So even a woman who goes into the system and they're pregnant, maternity, thinking about how do you deliver and give birth. There's also a high mortality rate for women in prison. And some of the things women are more likely to commit, and it's been increasing, death by suicide. So a lot of the things that women go in with, it actually is exasperated, and it's worse when they leave. And it could create lasting impact. And then I think women have a unique situation too, because over 50% of the women who go into prison go in as mothers. They leave and they were the primary caregiver of their children. And so automatically that relationship is severed when they get into the prison and figuring out how do you keep contact. So there are some really unique challenges with women who are incarcerated.
I want to focus in on the fact that prisons exacerbate rather than solve problems. The fact that there's this complex web of issues, causes, factors, all sorts of elements that you need to factor for why a person ends up in prison. And yet the prison system itself seems to fail at rehabilitation, seems to fail at any kind of restoration. It really is a form of like deep punishment for punishment's sake in so many ways. And that is a kind of telling scenario. So one, I'm wondering, does that track with your experience of listening to people on the inside and how once they enter along a continuum and they have to deal with the threat of prison continually thereafter? Does this track?
Absolutely. And I talked a lot about mobility as something before you enter and foreclosing the imagination of what one can be. But it's absolutely this idea around carcerality remains even when people are released, and they are constantly trying to mobilize themselves against it, like trying to move away from the collateral consequences of being incarcerated. So things like housing and employment, and even some of the ideas around a person's own value and self-worth, because they feel like they can't get a job where they can contribute their best possible selves. All of these become really important, which then was not just a psychological thing, but it's also a very real, like if you don't have a house to live in, how can you flourish? If you don't have some means to buy food and pay bills, how do you live? How do you even say you can raise a child in that circumstance? It's when you think about just these ideas around poverty can create entry, and then poverty is there when people, when women get out, and then the burden of proof is on women who have been incarcerated even more, so that they're worthy to prove that they can be a productive citizen in a society that has not given them the resources or the ability to really do that well.
Yeah. And so it really is a kind of mistaken story that to call it any kind of rehabilitation, any kind of restoration. And in light of that, I'm wondering if you would comment on how education, and in particular theological education, can invest in a more restorative, rehabilitative, and agency giving kind of project.
Absolutely. So I think that so much of education is really about what we know and that we're valued for what we know. And I think being in the prison, when I think about agency and about hope, it's really about being valued for who we become, and that education is about who we become. And I think the clearest kind of insight for me in the prison was when people described hope. So much of their identity was stuck in what they had done, or how people viewed them was stuck in what they had done. They were trapped in their mistakes, or trapped in their behaviors that got them incarcerated. And so when they talked about hope, hope was always about being able to be who they are, but also become who they're supposed to be, the possibility of becoming more. And so when I think about theological education, I'm not just thinking about what I want my students to know and how much information I want to give. That's important. But I'm also thinking about who I want them to be in society, and creating the type of educational experience that allows them to try out, to rehearse, where the classroom becomes a place where they can try on and try out different ways of being, whether that's things like critical dialogue, whether that's modeling being friends across difference, whether or not that's being able to advocate. How do our classroom become spaces where they can be and become? I also think about the experience of education sometimes can be competitive, especially depending on the institution you're in. Sometimes it could be isolating, especially if you don't come from a background where education was a norm in your family. And so how does education not be a space of just competition, but also a space where there's collaboration and communal encounter and connection, where people can really encounter each other as human beings, that has something valuable to teach? So the teacher isn't the only teacher in the classroom, but our lives become text in the classroom, which is prominent when you're teaching in the prison classroom. The student's life become text. And then lastly is how does the classroom become a site where students can even practice kind of resistance and being able to advocate for the common good? And I think those are some of the ways that I think about theological education, that I think being in a prison forces us to ask the question about what is the purpose of theological education? Who are our students? And even in a classroom behind our institutional walls, is that the best place for theological education to take place?
I want to talk a little bit more about this, and then I know you explore it in chapter 5 of the book. The idea that it's an alternative, and you say transgressive space, theological education as resistance to what is the norm of prison life. And that it's a kind of way to break free in a very important way. And I think thinking about education in this way there's a lot of fascinating letters that we have, books that were written in prison, historically speaking. But I love this idea of theological education as a transgressive act for these prisoners. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Every program does it different. But even when we talk to our students, we call them theologians. And so just this idea that they could be a theologian, that they could participate in this critical way of thinking about the Bible, was in and of itself a transgressive act. It was interesting also just because some of the rules that the prison had, for instance, where you couldn't call people by their first name, you had to call them by their last name, and being able to even transgress that and say, no, we're going to call them theologians. That's going to be their identity. So just being able to live into a new identity, I think, is transgressive. I think a lot of women in those spaces also was able to, just like when we go, other students come into a seminary space, they're able to question some of the kind of tacit assumptions, the taken for granted ways in which they've been formed theologically, that cause them to think about themselves and God in maybe sometimes very distorted ways. And so being in that space, in a community of learners, allowed them to grapple with some of their own theological assumptions, their embedded theology, and be able to name things differently, name their own reality, but also reclaim a way of seeing themselves and a way of seeing God that was able to give them a sense of agency in the prison environment. And some of the assignments we did, I think, also invited women into that space. For instance, their final year was a year where they had to do a leadership project. And one of our women in the prison created a library, a theological library that was continued to be used after the project itself, that continued to serve as a resource for all of those in the prison that were taking the theology certificate. Those are some of the ways that immediately come to mind.
You talk about this idea that hope seems more dangerous than living. And so you have this quote, and I'm coming from the preface. I'm wondering if you would read that quote.
What happens when hope seems more dangerous than living? It's just too difficult to hope, a student said. Hope is like a roller coaster for me. With my parole hearing coming up and the recent medical news I received, I just cannot afford to hope.
I mean, that statement is just heartbreaking. And to listen to that and to hear that, it's also, I realize from my perspective, it's a privilege to call it merely heartbreaking. From her perspective, it's a necessity. And help me, but help the listener as well, just understand that sentiment, that it's too difficult to hope. And how do you move on from that?
This student said this to me in the context I had been teaching a class actually called Perspectives on Hope. And she was in the class. And one day when I came in, I saw her and she was sitting somber. And very respectful, but you could tell she had a resolve. And she had told me she was just going to try out the class. I went and I asked her, was she going to continue in the class? And this is what she said, that it's just too difficult. She couldn't do it. And this was also within the time frame that one of our students who was on death row, their hearing had come up. It was time for them to be sentenced and to go through with the process. And for whatever reason, there were like 2 or 3 stays on the execution. And so I was teaching this class on Perspectives of Hope during a time when there was literally a roller coaster with one of the women who many of the people in our classrooms had really grown to respect. And so she wasn't the only student that dropped the class where we were supposed to be talking about Perspectives of Hope. I think I had 2 other students drop the class, and it was for similar reasons, that life is already hard. You know, we all wrestle with this desire, this capacity, this kind of the need to hope, right? But I think with women who are incarcerated, who have no control over so much of their lives, and literally, right? Like things as simple as when they go to sleep and when they wake up, what they eat, how they can play and can't play, how they can connect with people. And to be in a situation where there is one thing after another,
right,
kind of they're confronted with, and they have no control or feel like they are completely out of control. I think for them to hope, it means that if their hope is disappointed or thwarted, it really could be like death dealing. Hoping can be death dealing.
In what sense then can there be this restorative hope? Can you say more about how to help someone along through to that vision of restorative hope that you try to outline in the book?
When I talk about restorative hope, I'm thinking of it as holistic in the sense that it's a way of seeing, it's a way of knowing, it's a way of being, and it's a way of doing that kind of leads to life-giving possibilities. And when I talk about the ways in which hope is nurtured and sustained in a prison, there are 3 things that I talk about. One is kind of identity reformation, or being able to live into an authentic sense of self. The second is connection, and the third is resilience. And I want to focus with this question on connection, because when I talk about hope, a lot of times when we think about hope, it's isolated and it's privatized. And the notion of hope that I'm talking about is communal and public, and hope and help are connected. And so just even the sense of it's us having a responsibility for being with people in those spaces become really critical. And so one of the ways in which women describe the prison is as darkness, as just like utter darkness. I heard that so many times in my interviews. And when I asked one woman to describe hope, she drew a picture. And in the picture, she just drew herself in a circle of utter darkness. And then there was light from the outside. And she talked about how hope for her was light. And that the reason why she knew there was a God is because there had been some situations, even within herself, but in that place where it was just utter darkness. And the only way hope could come in is through an outside, something beyond herself. And so when I think about just the ability to walk someone alongside, I think connection and the connection to self, others, and God is important, but also this idea of institutional connection where people's interpersonal relationships actually mobilize them to create possibilities for people who are either incarcerated or coming out, who are returning citizens, to get them jobs, to get them to help them have the things that poverty sometimes neglects, or the things that system sometimes restricts and keeps. But other people in situations can sometimes mediate and help people in those very physical, kind of practical ways. But also when I think about walking someone along, it's also about people being able to rewrite their future and rewrite their story, that being able to see that where they are now is not the final say, that life can be the final say, that possibility can be the final say, and being able to help people imagine the ways in which that might happen for them amidst everything else that's going on, which can be challenging, but is also what I would say a responsibility of people who have the luxury of hoping without the kind of deep-seated challenges that other people experience.
What I hear in that hope and help and the communal nature of the hope that you describe, and it brings me, I do want to hear how womanist theology and those perspectives on inhabiting a particular, I love this phrase of this kind of the mundane art of surviving oppressive contexts that womanist theology can offer, which you really do need to think of prison as this kind of course, dark and dangerous mundane, that it's almost extinguishing. The idea of a light completely going out is there. And yet I'm just curious how womanist theology has offered any resources for thinking through the kind of hope that you're putting on offer here.
Absolutely. I think womanist theology helps us think about women's embodied experiences in prison and their voice, and that their voice matters. And when I think about Dolores Williams and her brilliance with Hagar, when she provides an exemplar with Hagar to help us ask new questions, I think those new questions are things that are also questions that help us reimagine the types of questions we should be asking when we think about prison. So for instance, Hagar was asking both about her life and her son's life. So Dolores Williams, she highlights Hagar as a character and really talks about her as a slave woman and compares her to African American women. And so she really does re-illustrate this narrative or re-narrate this story that so many of us have learned. And many of us have learned to look at Hagar as an afterthought. But what Dolores Williams does is she centers Hagar and Hagar's narratives. And so in ways in which Black women are invisibilized, Williams then centers her narrative. And so when we think about just reimagining prison and how womanist theology will help us to reimagine prison, I think there are questions that Dolores Williams asks when she's talking about Hagar that I think are important for us to ask when we're thinking about prison. For instance, Hagar was asking about both her and her son's life as a slave woman. She also wanted to know in very practical ways how she could continue to live. And so she wasn't just thinking about these ephemeral kind of things that's flighty in a way, but she was thinking about things like water. How can I get water to survive this wilderness that I'm living in, which is, I think, another way you can think about prison as a wilderness. But there is also this story of being seen, where she is now seen, so that the society that had tried to invisibilize her did not win because she was seen by God. And so what does that mean for how we reimagine and rethink about prison? I think that processes and procedures in prison, if it was a womanist way of thinking, would be marked by healing and wholeness, not just for women in the prison system, but also for society in general, that voices are unmuted, that bodies that have been criminalized and marginalized actually become part of us, helping us to rethink the ways in which processes and procedures should be done. What would happen if people took serious the experiences of women who were at these prison tables as making decisions for women in ways that are completely not gender responsive? I think if women took the lead, they will also highlight well-being and flourishing. For self would just be just as important as care for others, which is another way I think I've seen women in the prison lean into a way of like resilience and a body that's marginalized and isolated, women exercising, women looking for communion and community in that space in ways that are very womanish, very sassy and very transgressive. Nancy Lynn Westfield talks about the gathering, the ways in which Black women have found ways to gather outside of being surveilled. We did that during slavery with the hush harbors. And I think these spaces, you see this sort of agency happening inside the prison where women are creating these spaces despite the system. But I think these spaces would be, it would be celebrated. So those are some of the things that I think of off the bat for womanish theology.
The idea of seeing the woman that would be invisibilized, that would otherwise be invisible, bringing a theological education into the prison space to be able to see those women and not just keep them in the margin, not keep them behind the darkness of a prison, but to be able to see them and to face the realities that they represent. The kind of work of bringing that out into the open, out into a communal place, and doing that as a transgressive act of protest. That's a really beautiful thing. I wonder if you would close by, what do you hope people take from this book and the work that you've put into it and the stories that you shared through it?
I hope people leave knowing that hope is a luxury for some, and that hope is very complicated, and the ways in which women practice agency in those spaces is really complicated. So when I think about one particular story where I was about to teach and a woman was sitting outside crying, she wasn't actually one of my students, but I was trying to get her in the classroom because I knew if the guard came by, she would get in trouble for not being in the classroom. So I said, just come into my classroom. And so I was talking to her, and she was saying that she had to make a choice today about whether or not she would continue in the class and getting a certificate of theological studies, or if she would visit with her son during those times. So that she had to make a choice. As we think about education in the prison, that's flourishing, that's caring for yourself and your child for the future. But when you think about visitation, that's like a very real kind of in the moment, you want to be present for your child now. And she had to make a decision between two impossible decisions. She had to make a decision between two hard choices. And she ended up doing the visitation with her son. But sometimes women in the prison are making choices between two really impossible decisions. And so when we think about agency, when we think about hope, I want people to leave thinking about that type of context, that it's not black and white, but it's very nuanced. And it really does require a sort of ability to move out among and beyond these circumstances in order to survive and especially to flourish.
I think one of the lasting impressions your book has had on me is this idea of hope as movement and mobility. Is that even beginning to just go through those motions, and the kind of gift that you gave those women in offering them an educational space and encouraging them, pushing them to move and to fight and to act, to find their agency. That's really beautiful. I love that addition to the meaning of hope that you're offering in this book.
Thank you.
So, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
Of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Sarah Farmer, production assistance by Alexa Rollo. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu, where you can find past episodes, articles, books, and other educational resources to help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're new to the show, remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And to our loyal supporters and our faithful listeners, we've got a humble request, just like we do every week. If you haven't yet, we would love for you to share this episode or tell a friend about it. Here's a few ideas for how to do it. First, you could hit the share button for this episode and send it by text or email. You could share it to your social feed. You could also give us an honest rating in Apple Podcasts. Even more, you could write a short review of the show in Apple Podcasts. You could put in your own words why you like the show, what's most meaningful to you, and even how we can improve. Thanks for your listening and for your support, and we'll be back with more soon.